Hello, and welcome to Apologetics 101, and welcome to the Genesis Controversy, Episode 3. I said I would do this right after I did the other video of Biblical Authority. I laid a few foundational works. Now, I'm going to be probably dealing with a particular subject matter for a while in different various forms, a video here, a video there, a video series, etc. But basically, I'm not going to really be going in order. I might jump around to other things as well, but because I want to do, because I've been on Bill Craig's. Most of y'all probably heard Dr. William Lane Craig. He rejects Genesis chapters 1 through 11 as straightforward history. He thinks it's mytho-history, so he has a particular argument. And William Lane Craig wrote a book here called In Quest of the Historical Adam, which I've been going through feverishly just the past, several weeks. I've been going through it, taking notes, getting other books, going through them, and I'm writing a response book to Bill Craig's argument there in that book. And I've been given permission to do this, legal permission, by the subsidiary rights department person of Erdman's publishing. This is the publishing that publishes his book. So I've actually given permission to do this, and so that's what I've been working on lately, and that's why I haven't produced a video in a while. And I mentioned something about it in my last video, and I want to do a response to, because Bill Craig has a First Things article as well. I want to do a response to that eventually, and I ain't doing it yet because I came across, because I've been looking at Dr. Jason Lisle's response to Bill Craig. Every 2 weeks he would bring out another article. I loved his response. He did an awesome job at it. But there was another guy that decided to respond to Dr. Jason Lisle in the form of an article. And so I came across this, and I decided I want to sit there and do a video response to each one of the parts that this guy had. Now, so far, let me go ahead and bring that up. Well, before I bring that up, let's cue the intro and get that over with. Well, that's what we're doing today. We're going to be responding to a guy who responded to Dr. Jason Lisle. Now, his response, he's only done so far 3 parts to his response. Jason Lisle today has 5 parts out, but he put the 5th part very recently, like last Friday, a couple days ago, and from the date of this video. And I think he's got one more part coming out, at least one more part. I'm thinking that's going to be the end of his response, possibly. I don't know, but that's going to be coming out in a couple weeks, because he does it like every 2 weeks, and he does it like clockwork. Every 2 weeks he does a response to a segment of Dr. Jason Lisle's article, First Things. Now, this guy does a response to Dr. Jason Lisle in his post, and he only has 3 posts up so far. I don't know why he hasn't got at least the 4th one up. I looked everywhere for it, and all I could find was 3 parts to it. So we'll be dealing with those 3 parts. Not to that all 3 of them today. I'm going to deal with them each in turn. And if he does come out with a 4th part, I will respond to it as well. And the 5th part, and so forth. And I will also be linking Dr. Jason Lisle's article in the description box below. I will also be linking this guy that I'm responding to article in the description box below. And I will also be linking the First Things article that William Lane Craig had originally produced that Dr. Jason Lisle responded to, and this guy's responding to Jason Lisle, also in the description box. Alright, so without further ado, let's dive into this. The guy's name, I think, is Joel Edmund Anderson. Don't know who he is, but in this description he claims to be a Bible scholar. Okay, that's fine. But we'll see just how scholarly he is in his assessment here. Interesting title for a blog post, Resurrecting Orthodoxy, since he's an old earth creationist, and old earth creationism is not an orthodox position. The orthodox position is actually young earth creationism, and a straightforward rendering of Genesis 1 is the orthodox position. It's always been the orthodox position of the church. So that's kind of a weird name for it, since he's actually going against an orthodox position. But he is arguing against Dr. Jason Lisle's argument here. Alright, the title of his article, the first part of his article, that's what we're going to be responding to today, is Jason Lisle, William Lane Craig, and the historical Adam walk into a bar. We got 3 periods, part 1. Now, in spite that he doesn't name each part the same thing, he actually names them differently, but he just continues saying part 2, part 3, as he continues to walk through the article that was produced by Dr. Jason Lisle. Again, I will be putting those 3 articles in the description box below, so please check them out so you can review them for yourself. Alright, here's what he says. He starts out by saying, last month, he's talking about part 1, I guess, of Jason Lisle's argument. So Jason Lisle of the Young Earth Creationist organization, Biblical Science Institute, began a blog series in which he critiqued William Lane Craig's recent book, The Quest for the Historical Adam. Today he has written 2 parts in this series with more to come. Alright. The first couple points I want to point out right now in his introduction, they're trivial, but they still matter in the long run, ultimately. Because, and I'll tell you in a minute why I think this might matter. But, okay, first of all, Jason Lisle actually wasn't responding to Bill Craig's book. This is Bill Craig's book, and in fact, that's the second mistake that he makes in the thing, is he gets Bill Craig's book's title actually wrong. It's not The Quest for the Historical Adam, it's In Quest of the Historical Adam. Okay? Even though he believes Adam existed, he doesn't believe what is stated about Adam in the Bible, particularly the book of Genesis chapters 1 through 11, but even by New Testament writers, is historically accurate in that sense. As far as New Testament writers go, he just thinks that that's a literary Adam rather than a historical Adam. He tries to make an artificial distinction with those two, but I'm not going to get into all that because that's not going to become relevant right now. So that's the second problem he has, because he has a different title than what he presents. Now, it might be seen like trivial questioning, but it's more than that, because sometimes I wonder if he really understood either Craig's arguments or Dr. Jason Lisle's arguments. And here's the thing. He thinks that Dr. Jason Lisle is responding to Bill's book. He admits in this introduction thing, he didn't really read all of Craig's book. I think he says he read some of it, but he didn't really read that much. He picked up on Craig's arguments from some of the lectures and interviews that he's done. He don't seem to be aware of the First Things article that was written by Dr. Craig, which is what Jason Lisle is actually responding to. Now, you think if you're going to write a blog post against a response someone's doing, you at least know what he's responding to. Alright? He thinks that he's responding to Bill Craig's book. No, he's responding to Bill Craig's article in First Things, which, by the way, is available online for free, like I said, in the link in the description box below. you'll be able to link directly to it. Alright, and you can see that, and all the quotations that he quotes of Craig also comes out of this First Things article. So he's not at all responding to his book. I don't even know if Jason Lisle's read Craig's book or not, but he is responding to his First Things article. I believe Dr. Jason Lisle says that in part 1 of the thing. And by the way, he makes these same mistakes in part 2, this guy, in not quoting the book correctly, not realizing that Jason Lisle is not responding to his book, he's responding to this article, and he makes the same mistakes in the second part too. So you figure by the time part 2, at least, I can understand part 1, maybe he just didn't catch it, maybe he just was completely unaware of that. But by this time he writes part 2, you know, a couple weeks later or something, or, you know, whatever the case may be, he would have found out about that. But in any given case, he goes further. He says, okay, these might seem trivial, but they seem to really speak on how much he really knows the issues. How can you not know that Bill Craig wrote an article in First Things in which is what Jason Lisle is actually responding to, especially when Jason Lisle mentions it at the very beginning of part 1. Alright. Okay, he goes further. His series with more to come, talking about Jason Lisle. Now, I haven't written that much lately on either the creation evolution debate in general or a specific topic regarding the historicity of Adam, but William Craig's new book, of which I have not yet read. Listen to that. I have not yet read. It does show up in his arguments. Has clearly caused an uptick in discussions online regarding the question of the historical Adam. Yes, it has. Consequently, over the past few weeks, I've found myself reading a number of new online articles as well as a few books on the topic again. And being me, it was only a matter of time until I decided to write a few more blog posts myself on the new material I've been reading. In these next couple of posts, I am going to focus on Jason Lisle's take on William Lane Craig's book. He never had a take on his book. The article was 100% against the statements that Bill Craig had made in his First Things article. Again, linked in the description box below. Apparently he wasn't aware that Bill Craig wrote an article like that. Alright, like I've already said, of course if he's been reading it online, he would have come across it. I came across it by accident online, so I was, even before I read Jason Lisle's arguments. Like I've already said, I haven't yet read William Lane Craig's book. No, he hasn't. But I have read a number of articles on it and have watched a number of interviews he has done about it. I guess he seems to, because he's done that, he can know enough about his position to defend it. Which I don't think he does, but anyway, I thus feel that I have a pretty good general idea regarding what he argues in his book. I know what he argues in his book, so I'm not so sure if he does. There's a few points here and there that matches Craig, but anyway, as for Lisle, I read quite a few articles he wrote while at Answers in Genesis, and thus already had a good idea of his criticism of William Lane Craig's book would be. Except he's not criticizing William Lane Craig's book. Again, he's criticizing William Lane Craig's First Things article. He didn't disappoint. No, he didn't. In Lisle's initial article critiquing William Lane Craig's book, he lays it out in the following way. A, he provides a quotation from William Lane Craig's book. No, he provides a quotation from the article, which he apparently is unaware of. Then B, he provides his own response to that William Lane Craig quote, which he does provide a response to it. The article thus consists of 6 William Lane Craig quotes and 6 responses by Lisle. I'm going to follow that pattern by A, giving the William Lane Craig quote in bold, B, summarizing Lisle's response in italics, then C, providing my own reaction to what Lisle has said. Let's begin. Alright, he's quoting quote 1, number 1, Craig's statement from his First Things article. What historical claims does the Bible make about Adam and Eve, and is belief in a historical Adam and Eve compatible with scientific evidence? Lisle responds by stating up front that the scriptures clearly take Adam and Eve to be real historical people, based on the fact that various authors make reference to them. He then correctly notes that William Lane Craig's second question is a bit odd. For example, if one was asked if Socrates really existed, one would ask if its existence was proven by the historical evidence, not scientific evidence. Nevertheless, Lisle implies that William Lane Craig is really evaluating the Bible based on what is scientifically possible, and then brings up the example of Jesus' resurrection to show that William Lane Craig is being inconsistent. Presumably, William Lane Craig believes Jesus rose from the dead, despite the fact that such a thing goes against science. So why does he treat claims of the historicity of Adam differently? Then Lisle then says he knows why. William Lane Craig already has his accepted the secular story of origins, which really isn't scientific at all. Here he does a good job of stillmanning Dr. Jason Lisle's position. Unfortunately, he doesn't keep that way. He'll keep it right here, but then when he gets down to here, he'll actually go against it. He'll actually wind up making a statement that would show that he fundamentally misunderstood his argument, which is kind of weird because he correctly stillmans it up here. He knows he was talking about the scientific possibility, and he gave the example of the resurrection. I mean, as an example of that, you would ask if there's historical evidence for Jesus' resurrection, not scientific evidence, because it is history, not science. And on top of that, we wouldn't qualify a miracle, because if it's scientifically possible for it to happen, in limiting God, what God can and cannot do. So that's the point that Lisle is making, and he stillmans him correctly here. But then he'll revert back from it. We'll see. He says, he says, Lisle actually makes a good point up front in that yes he did, and it is odd that William Lane Craig seemed to be seeking scientific evidence to substitute a question of historicity. In fact, this is similar to something that irks me a bit. When I read exegetical books that wrestle with the historicity of Adam, the starting point always seems to come at question through the lens of science. Now, obviously, there is something wrong with science, or nothing wrong with science. But when you ask questions about historicity of the figure in a given text, asking scientific questions is an odd place to start. I agree with that. I think there are two more basic questions to ask. One, are there clear historical indicators within the text that can be substantiated historically? And two, what is the genre of the given text? These are good questions. So this right here is not bad, but listen further. Of course, my response to those two questions is polar opposite to what Lisle's response will be. Case in point, Lisle's attempt to equate the question of the historicity of Adam with the resurrection claims of Jesus in the Gospels. Okay, understand, he understood that he was making the point that he asked if the resurrection was scientifically possible. You don't sit there and ask that question of a historical claim. That was the whole point that he was making. He correctly stillmans him above. He seems to understand the argument, but then he's going to deviate away from that understanding. Alright. He said, Lisle's attempt to equate the question of the historicity of Adam with the resurrection claims of Jesus in the Gospels. Lisle's logic is along the lines of, if we should question the historicity of Adam based on modern scientific findings, then why shouldn't we question the reality of Jesus' resurrection? Now, that's not actually his point. The point that he's actually making is that if Adam and Eve is, you don't ask what is scientific evidence for Adam and Eve. Versus, would you ask that for the resurrection? That was the whole point that Lisle was trying to make. Now, he twists what Lisle was actually trying to make here to saying, hey, why don't you look for these kinds of findings with Jesus' resurrection. The point that he's making is simply this: that you don't look for scientific possibilities with the resurrection, because it's a miracle. He goes to that. I would say two things. First, modern science and genetics has convincingly shown that the entire human race did not descend from a single couple a mere 6,000 years ago. Alright, several things on this. Okay, first of all, convincingly. Notice how he doesn't give us any evidence that's convincing, persuasive. He's conflating persuasion and proof. Persuasion and proof are not the same thing. Proof is the evidence, and in some cases even the amount of evidence or the body of evidence that you might have to prove a particular point or a particular conclusion. Persuasion is a person's willingness to accept the evidence or even a particular conclusion that the evidence supports. That's what persuasion is. The fact that he's persuaded does not necessarily mean there's good reasons to be persuaded. Okay? People are persuaded for lots of things. I've seen people get persuaded over fallacies. Appeal to authority. You cite your favorite authority and he just happens to agree with your thinking and you accept it. I've seen people go to that limits. They don't need any evidence at all or any good reason at all to support the conclusion. They just need to have someone rubber stamp what they already think. But that's not what evidence is, and you got to present the evidence. The fact that he's persuaded doesn't mean there's good reasons for it. Now, with that said, is there good reasons for it? No. I actually read, right here, in this book, Searching for Adam, in chapter 10, concerning genetics, actually. And they went through like type 1, type 2, type 3 experiments. All the genetic experiments that have been done evolution-wise have been up to type 2 and 3. 2 and 3. Type 3 doesn't prove anything at all. Because you got two different worldviews, both have certain predictions and expectations, and they're the exact same, as far as the expectation and prediction. So you don't really prove anything. Type 2, you've got the worldview versus itself, and it doesn't really prove anything because the worldview already expects it and so forth. But type 1 experiments is usually the ones that scientists like. And there's really only one type of type 1 experiment with genetics that would work, and that's with mitochondria DNA, because only the female can pass along mitochondria DNA. And because of this, we can actually go and calculate from upwards, from like the point where civilization was bottlenecked around the flood, and calculate upward. And so that's what they did. And when they did, what they did was to calculate the number of mutations that are actually developed, and they even assumed uniformitarianism. Just to be generous to those assumptions, uniformitarianism, and they assumed uniformitarianism, so they assumed that the mutations were uniform, and still it arrived at a percentage of mutations since that time up to now. I think it was by the process of mutation to mitochondrial DNA in just 4,364 years since the time of the flood. Humans would have accumulated only 30 to 114 mutations. Currently, about 78 differences exist on average in African populations, i.e. the most genetically diverse of all the human ethnic groups, with a maximum difference of 120. Clearly, the YAC timescale accurately predicts the number of DNA differences that we observe today, while the evolutionary timescale predicts numbers on order of magnitude higher. Similar results hold true in animal species. They find it to be true of other animal species as well. This is that is by Dr. Nathaniel Jensen and Dr. Jeffrey Tompkins in chapter 10 of Searching for Adam, Genesis and the Truth About Origins, pages 315 and 316. So the evidence actually supports the fact that the number of mutations seems to support the time frame that is given in the Bible, but it doesn't support evolution. And this is a type 1 one. So this is literally pitting one worldview against another, because we make very different claims about deep time, about time assumptions. You know, older evolutionists as deep time, while we believe the world is approximately 6,000 years old. All right. So what he's saying here is just simply not true, and I would challenge him to provide the evidence of this, because he doesn't provide any of the evidence for it. All right. He says, second, the claim of Jesus' resurrection is found in the Gospels, which are in the genre of ancient historical biography. Notice the assumption. The assumption is the Gospels are history, while Genesis chapter 1 through 11 isn't. That's false. That's actually circular, because it assumes his conclusion. But the reason you can actually compare them, because it is actually being, Genesis chapter 1 through 11 is actually being presented as real history by the author. And the Gospels are Greco-Roman biography, which is the historical narrative is kind of a more larger genre of, just history, basically. Like historiographies, like the history of Peloponnesian War, or Greco-Roman biographies, like the Gospels, like Josephus's biography, Philo's biography of Moses, Plutarch's biographies, etc. And the way we know this is we contrast other known genres of similar matter, and we know that the literary genre matches. That's how we know. And that's what we did with Genesis chapters 1 through 11, and that's how we know its historical narrative. And he says it is presented as history, so is Genesis chapter 1 through 11, and there are a host of items throughout the Gospels that are provably historical. Now here, the guy conflates two different categories. He makes a categorical error. He conflates categories. Okay, the question of whether or not what literary genre it is, okay, is a different question to whether it's right historically. That's a separate question. The writer is presenting the information as if it's history, okay? But, technically speaking, a writer could be completely wrong about everything he's saying and it still be historical narrative. There are lots of texts like that. There have lots of errors in it, but yet it's still historical narrative. I'm not saying Genesis chapter 1 to 11 has errors, and I don't think it is. I do believe it is inspired inerrant literature. But what I am saying is, simply put, that these are two separate questions. What counts as historical narrative has nothing to do with whether it's historically right or not. And of course, I would actually contend that by saying there is historical evidence outside of Genesis chapter 1 to 11. For example, the fact that there's flood stories in every culture around the world, roughly about 300. In every culture around the world there's a flood story. Most of them, the vast majority of them, are global floods. And this counts as historical evidence of this. And there are other things too, and we can point out some consistencies with scientific information as well that also supports this on Genesis chapters 1 through 11. But we do have evidence outside of that. But it also assumes that the text is guilty until proven innocent. He seems to think that it can't be considered historically accurate unless we have corroborating evidence. That is the skeptic's mentality. That's what skeptics claim. Because skeptics believe that the text is guilty until proven innocent. That's not how Christians ought to approach the text. That's not even how historians generally approach the text. That's just not very historically, that's not really like a historian, because it's not in accordance to historical methodology. We assume it's innocent until proven guilty. All right. So, also the text, like I said, that there is evidence outside of Genesis chapter 1 through 11. Now, understand something. Does it not qualify as historical evidence unless there's corroborating evidence outside of it? then what will he do when he finds out that there are things in the Gospels which we have no further evidence for? For example, there's a reference in Matthew about the saints coming out of the graves. And we have no other evidence except what was in Matthew. There is no historical source that tells us about Jesus piercing. We have some indirect sources that tells us that they were allowed to sit there and pierce their dead, to make sure that they were dead. But the spirit thrust is only found in the Gospel of John. If it's not being corroborated with another source, that doesn't make it wrong. That doesn't make it non-historical. Plus, it does actually conflate categories as well. He goes further, he says, by contrast, Genesis 1 through 11 is in the genre of ancient Near Eastern myth. This is contrary to what even Craig says in his book. Craig actually never claims that these are of the genre of ancient Near Eastern myth. He claims that they're of the genre of Mytho-History, which is an artificial term that he didn't come up with it. Someone else came up with it, but he borrowed the term, and he thinks that they are describing events in figurative language, clothed in the language of myth. And it's not to be taken literally. That's what he believes. And he agrees that he thinks that this is a unique genre, is what he called it, which is pretty much admitting that there's no other existing genre out there called Mytho-History, which there isn't. It's actually an oxymoron. Jason Lisle will mention that again, I think, in part 4 of his thing, which we're not going to be dealing with right now. But I had already said it was oxymoron in a comment section about a month before you wrote that article. So I already knew that it was an oxymoron. Alright, so it's not of the ancient Near Eastern myth. There's fundamental differences between ancient Near Eastern myth and Genesis chapters 1 through 11. Later, he will admit that there are differences. And we'll get to that here in a second, or in a little bit. Now, let's go ahead and look at some of these. Let me finish this off real quick. Ancient Near Eastern myth, something Lisle will contest, and rightly so. And there simply isn't much, if anything, in Genesis 1 through 11 that is provable historical. Again, he's conflating that historical with, whether it can be proven historically or not, beyond Genesis chapter 1 through 11, and he's assuming it's guilty of being proven innocent, and he's conflating categories. And plus, I think there is historical evidence, quite a bit actually, and some indirect scientific evidence, such as geological evidence for the global flood, such as erosion all over the world, planation surfaces, the fact that mollusk shells are found closed, fossilized. Mollusk shells should be found apart, fossilized. They open up after they die, like clams and stuff. They open up after they die, and they have this soft part connecting the two halves called carbonate nitrate, and it's basically very soft. It degrades in a couple hours. So you should have two halves found fossilized, but most of them are found fossilized closed, which shows a strong evidence of rapid burial. And so, there's lots of evidence outside of Genesis chapter 1 through 11, but we shouldn't assume it's guilty to proven innocent in the first place. Now, he could also, I doubt it because he seems to conflate categories here, but he could also be saying that he doesn't think it's historical narrative, but there's lots of evidence in the historical narrative. You got the vav consecutives in Genesis chapter 1 in the form of the verb form vahito, that's found after verse 3 and following, all the way up to chapter 2, verse 3. And this is indicative of Hebrew historical narrative. The Hebrew historical narrative have this, such as Numbers chapter 7, for example. There's also a series of toledotes in Genesis chapter 1 to 11. Chapter 5 and chapter 11 have this. And it's very much like chapter 25. And Craig and him agrees that chapter 12 to 50 is historical narrative. And chapter 25 has these, and it's very similar to what we see in chapter 5 and chapter, actually exactly the same except different genealogies. chapter 5 and chapter 11. And the kinds of information in there, such as it telling the times of death, or the when a person, how old a person was when a person was born, how old were they when they died. These kinds of things you do not see in ancient Near Eastern myths. Also, most of the ancient Near Eastern myths are written in poetic narrative. Let's go to some of these and we'll look at them. All right. Let's do this one right here. This is a very famous one, Enuma Elish. And this right here is written in poetic narrative. You can see the parallelism in it. Okay, I will read a few lines of it just to get a good idea. It says, when in the height of heaven was not named, and the earth beneath did not yet bear a name, and the primeval Apsu who begat them, and chaos, Tiamat, the mother of them both, their waters were mingled together, and so field was formed, no marsh was to be seen, when the gods none had been called into being, and none bore a name, and no destinies were ordained. I mean, you could tell, like it says, when the gods none, when of the gods none had been called into being, it says, and none bore a name, and no destinies were ordained. Then were created the gods in the midst of heaven. Lahuma and Lahamu were called into being. The 3 dots represents fragmented. This is actually fragmented. And so you get the picture. This is poetic narrative. This is very much different from Genesis chapters 1 through 11. Also, by the way, this is the Epic of Gilgamesh. Also, by the way, these stories they create out of pre-existing matter. They often create from chaos. Usually have a chaos monster, Tiamat, that we just read, for example. And in the Greek myth, it's the Titans, not the football team, but Titans. And they like I said, most of them are written in poetic narrative. They often include creation of other gods, all during the time that they're writing it. Well, yeah, so they're fundamentally different. If you actually read them, come to terms and actually read them, you'd see how different they are. They are very, very different from each other. See, here's one. Enki Ninimah. In those days, in the days when heaven and earth were created, in the nights when heaven and earth were created, in those years, in the years when fates were determined. I mean, you can see the poeticness in it. It's different. It's very different from what we see in Genesis chapters 1 to 11. Now, understand something. He will ultimately, he will admit to the differences later on down the road. We'll get to that when we come to it, though. But anyway, they are not of the ancient Near Eastern myth. They are most certainly historical narrative. And there's actually even other evidences for them in historical narrative. For example, the kinds of finite verbs that have been found in this, in those texts, are indicative of the kinds of verbs we find, the finite verbs that we find in historical narrative, Hebrew historical narrative. Whereas Hebrew poetic narrative, we find completely different finite verbs. And even Bill Craig, in his book, actually even admit to them being that the text is not poetic narrative, which I think is an honest admission by him, because I wouldn't think that he would admit that. I mean, it would work better for his thesis if it was Hebrew poetic narrative, because in poetic narrative, figurative language abounds. And figurative language is always the rule, never the exception. In historical narrative, figurative language is always the exception, never the rule. and it's heavily contextualized. So, yeah, so I find this to be an honest admission, although a dooming one, but it is nonetheless what it is. But he does admit that it's not poetic narrative. All right, quote number 2, Craig. In order to avoid the pitfalls of reading contemporary science into the biblical text, it is best to treat these questions separately. Lisle says he actually agrees, but then says that William Lane Craig isn't really doing this. Lisle says there's no question that the author of the Bible and God, the divine author himself, thought of Genesis anything other than literal history. And then he says William Lane Craig is wrong for not seeing that contemporary science is nothing more than secular materialistic speculations about the past, and goes on to claim that the kind of science one can do in a lab actually is consistent with literal historical history recorded in Genesis. Alright, he says, me. Here in Lisle's second response, we find the start of a reoccurring claim he makes over and over again. He's responding to quotes that are made directly by Bill Craig. And so every single time he's going to push the point that these are historical narrative. This guy doesn't understand it. He pounces on this. He says, oh, he keeps repeating this. Oh, just because back he repeats it doesn't make it so, which it doesn't. But he presents evidence as well. Interesting enough, when this guy summarizes Jason Lisle, he seems to either omit or tweak how he words the evidence. And he's presenting evidence, but then he'll say he's not presenting evidence, or he just made an assertion of it being historical narrative, and that doesn't make it so. But the interesting thing is that this guy keeps on making the assertion, doesn't he? He keeps making the assertion. Alright. He said, okay. Again, yes, William Lane Craig, Lisle, and me are all in agreement that the proper reading of the biblical text is a separate question than the scientific question of origins. But when Lisle then simply asserts that Genesis is literal history once, and then a second time that literal history is recorded in Genesis, I have to say that repeating that assertion does not make it true. He wasn't repeating it to make it true. He simply stated a fact. It's actually widely known that Genesis chapter 1 through 11 is historical narrative. I mean, this has been known since probably even before Stephen Boyd did his research on it on the Wraith Project. Stephen Boyd's a Hebrew scholar, and he did a literary analysis of Genesis chapter 1 through 11, which he came to the conclusion that it was historical narrative. So he's just simply stating the fact that's already known, and simply addressing the fact and he does present evidence for it. But because he summarizes them, you almost never see it, or it's been tweaked a bit. Alright, and reword it. Not only that, but Lisle and I see a lot of YECists doing this. It says, but Lisle and I see a lot of YECists doing this, immediately conflates the genre of Genesis 1 to 11 with the genre of the rest of Genesis 12 to 50. I'm not entirely certain what he means by this, but it appears to me that he is saying that if we make a contrast, if we say Genesis chapters 1 to 11 is just like chapters 12 through 50, then we're conflating the two. No, we're not. Okay, if your question is, what is the literary genre of Genesis chapter 1 through 11? Okay, you're willing to accept that chapter 12 through 50, and this guy appears to accept it, is willing to say that's historical narrative, and you look at other historical narrative as well, and you contrast that. That's how scholars figure out a literary analysis, by the way. That's how they do a literary analysis. How do we know that Revelation is apocalyptic? Because we compare it to other apocalyptic literature outside of the New Testament. That's how we know. And all Lisle or anyone has ever done, and by the way, Lisle actually doesn't do it here. He does it in another place where he can contrast them. But he only does that because they're willing to accept that Genesis chapter 12 to 50 is historical narrative. So he's showing that the style does not change between the chapters of these first 11 chapters verses chapter 12 to 50. And showing that the literary style is the same. That's all we're doing. That is the way scholars determine literary style. How does this guy expect someone to determine literary genre? This is one of the problems with trying to claim that that Genesis is creating this original literary style called Mytho-History. There's no document at all beyond Genesis chapters 1 through 11 that you can contrast to and say that's Mytho-History because of, XYZ. Because there's no Mytho-History genre out there. This is one of the problems that Craig faces a lot in his book when he tries to support his claim. And this is one that this guy faces as well. He says any competent reading, notice the begging question epithet fallacy, he did this, he loaded the term competent. In other words, if you don't read it the way he thinks it ought to be read, then you're incompetent. That's essentially what he's saying. That's incorrect. Any competent reading of Genesis will see a tremendous difference between the two sections. Okay, why does he say there's a tremendous difference between the two sections and he provides no example? None. He never does throughout the rest of it. I've read this entire post. He does not provide any examples at all. And he goes further and says, and for Lisle to conflate the two, he's not conflating them, he's comparing them, which is what scholars do. Is either shockingly ignorant, not ignorant, or purportedly misleading. This is the either-or fallacy, and there could be other alternatives. For example, you could argue whether someone's wrong or not, or you could even argue that he's right and he's wrong. So there's actually 4 possibilities. The fact that he doesn't agree with him doesn't make him ignorant or misleading. So this is the either-or fallacy. And he says, and I don't think Lisle's trying to mislead, so he thinks he's ignorant, in other words. He's pretty much implied that he thinks he's ignorant. I've studied Jason Lisle's, I got some of his books. I've got a book right here called The Physics of Einstein. This guy is very, very, very smart. He is a genius. I mean, I'm smart, but I'm nowhere near that level of intelligence. The guy's a math whiz. I'm not very good at math. That's not my strong suit. But yeah, this guy's very smart, and he's not informed. Okay, this is a guy that's been involved in this issue for probably almost as long as I've been alive. He is smart, and he's done this, and he's very well informed. Stupid, ignorant, none of those things would apply to Dr. Jason Lisle, unless you just really have no idea about, the kind of scientist this guy is. So yeah, that is a strong decharacterization of a man who is very honorable, very smart, and God has blessed greatly. So yeah. But again, competent reading. Notice he does not give. This is the thing that really gets me. He does not give any examples. He says they differ greatly, but they don't give examples. You notice how when I said that the Genesis 1 through 11 differ with all these myth literature. I gave examples after examples. Even showed you a few, right? Showed you a few on screen. I gave you, when I said this is historical narrative, I gave evidence for it being historical narrative. And, this guy says, oh, well, that these sections are tremendously different. That's what he says. That's his words. Tremendously different. Gives 0 examples. If they are tremendously different, then why can't you give 1 example of it? Alright. He goes further. He says, what's more, Lisle also goes out of his way to denigrate modern science. No, he doesn't. That's a strawman argument. In a minute, you'll see him make it even more. But modern science and evolutionary theory, by disparaging it as secular materialistic speculations about the past, since you can't prove it in a lab, evolution is just a speculative story made up by atheists. Okay, that whole line was one big strawman argument. Okay, first of all, he never said it was made up by atheists. It's made up by Charles Darwin. And Charles Darwin actually got his ideas from different people. So a lot of stuff he said wasn't really that unique to Charles Darwin. But in your case, this would be the book that Charles Darwin wrote on Origin of Species. That's the one that reveals his theory of evolution. But it is a speculation about the past. There's no evidence at all. And even Charles Darwin admitted problems to his theory, even at the time. For example, the lack of transitional fossils, he admitted that. He thought that the fossils were incomplete in his day and that the future fossil record will help support his position, which is special pleading. But after a long time after Charles Darwin has been on here, over 100,000 fossils all over the world, and we still don't have any transitional fossils. So, yeah. But it is a secular speculation about the past. But that has nothing to do with modern science. Okay, this is equivocation fallacy on the word science. He's equivocating the word science for a field of discipline and equivocates it to a particular model that's accepted by certain scientists. And he's equivocating this. He's saying because he's against evolution, then he must be against denigrating modern science. Even though there's a lot of scientists, and by the way, that includes Dr. Jason Lisle, that rejects evolution. They're not against science at all. They're not against that science. So this is a straw man argument. Apparently he doesn't fully understand Jason Lisle's position. Of course, I know a few scientists who will say you actually can prove quite a lot of evolutionary in a lab. Yeah, and they're all evolutionists to say that. And by the way, I have personally done research on every time someone has thrown a laboratory experiment that either is taking place today, now in labs, or has taken place, and I've looked them up, and they've all come down to variations within the kind. They've never been actual evolution. Evolution is horizontal change, not vertical change. Vertical change is like changes within the kind, variations within the genome. That is changes that are vertical, not horizontal. If they're horizontal, they will change from one kind to the next, or two kinds would have the same kind that existed in the past that would be a common ancestor of that. This would be adding new information onto the genome that wasn't presently there, which we've never observed into a lab at all. Evolution has never been observed, ever. Not in life, not in a laboratory experiment. And by the way, observed in a lab is essentially what operation science is. Observed in labs, observed in nature, observed in the universe, things like that. Things that we can observe and repeat. That's called operational science. Evolution is not part of operational science. That's why they call it origin science. It's not operational science. And since there's no evidence of it, yes, it is a speculation. That's what a speculation is. It's a guess. It's what you believe or think is true, and you have no reason to base that on. So yes, it is a speculation about the past. All right. Okay. So they don't prove evolution in a lab. I've never seen it. I had someone throw up a lab experiment, and I looked it up, and it was nothing more than them taking out certain components of one bacteria and putting it into another bacteria to come up with a variant of bacteria. So yeah, not evolution. So if you think that evolutions take place in a lab, give me the experiment. I will more than happy look it up, and then I'll get back to you on it. But evolution's never been done in a lab. All right. On top of that, I can't help but notice how Lisle immediately, after he agrees with William Lane Craig that we shouldn't try to read science into the biblical text, comes out and does that very thing by claiming that laboratory science is consistent with the literal reading of Genesis. Obviously, he doesn't explain how, because he can't, because it's not true. His last statement was false. Let me verify this first. Okay, Lisle is a presuppositionalist, like me, and so he is interpreting the evidence through a biblical Christian framework. Because like me, he thinks that science cannot be It's impossible to do science apart from a Christian biblical worldview. That's not to say that an atheist cannot do science. It just means they have to borrow from our worldview to do it. Assume objective morality. Assume objectivity of the laws of logic. Assume that we can trust our thoughts and the fact that we're rational creatures able to rationalize and come up with rational conclusions and things like that. And as a result, all evidence of science would have to be interpreted through a biblical framework. However, a lot of people don't interpret science through a biblical framework. They interpret it through a secular framework, through naturalism or some other worldview of that nature. And so what Lisle is saying is that he's not saying that we should insert scientific information into the Bible and try to, or scientific claims into the Bible, like a secular scientist says X, but the Bible really says Y, that we have to insert X into the Bible so it makes it say X2 when X is not there. No, that's not at all what we should do, and Lisle is saying that. But that doesn't mean we can never look at science. This shows a fundamental misunderstanding of Lisle's argument. He apparently realized that Lisle isn't saying you can never look at the science. He's just saying you can't interpret what the Bible says on the basis of what scientists say. But you can look and see the science to see if it's consistent with scriptural claims. That means if scripture claims X, the science found out that X is true. There's actual scientific evidence that reaffirms X. That's the whole point. If it's consistent with X, that's what Lisle's trying to do. And apparently he misunderstood that. And he says that it's not true. Yes, it is. Yes, it is. For example, let's take the Earth's magnetic field. I'm not going to go too much into the young Earth creationist debate on this. But let's say, there was a scientist named Dr. Russell Humphreys who predicted that Neptune and Uranus had a very strong magnetic field. Now, evolutionists predicted they wouldn't have a very strong magnetic field. Dynamo theories wouldn't recharge the magnetic field. Magnetic fields weaken over time. And on top of that, these planets were on their side. And not just the planets, the magnetic fields too, because that's what they discovered. And it turns out, and of course they thought that these planets, these billions of years old, and so the magnetic field would have been long gone. It turned out that they actually have very strong magnetic fields. This was proven by the probe that went by Neptune and Uranus and measured the magnetic field of them, which by the way matches the magnetic moment that was calculated by Russell Humphreys if they were 6,000 years old, approximately. And so the evolutionists were wrong. And of course there's also the weakening of Earth's magnetic field, and we can go further. All the solar system planets have strong magnetic fields. If you saw Mercury or Jupiter's magnetic field, it would be bigger than the Sun. Venus is actually rotates so fast that it's believed to have a solid core, and solid core would not work with a dynamo theory at all. And it has a very strong magnetic field, Venus does. So, yeah. So this claim that there's no evidence that supports it, yes there is. We also have evidence that supports that the universe is not only young. We got evidence of the universe young. We got evidence that the solar system is young. We got evidence that life is young. There's for example, blood cells that have been found in T-Rex bone. That they're proven blood cells, and biological molecules can't last more than 10,000 years. So you got that. You've got, and this was actually found in, I think half the bone was unfossilized as well. Interesting. And there are other things too, like carbon-14 inside, things that are supposed to be millions of years old, like dinosaur fossils, coal, oil, and that sort of thing. And there's also carbon-14 found inside diamonds. which diamonds are supposed to be hundreds of millions to billions of years old. And so this is very consistent with what is claimed by the Bible, as far as the age of the earth and so forth. And so yes, we do. And that evidence is consistent with it. See, he says it's not consistent with it and gives no examples. He gives no examples of how it's not consistent with it. This guy doesn't really give evidence much. On quote 3, it says, Craig, only after having determined what the Bible actually says about the historical Adam shall we be in a position to judge whether these claims are compatible with what we know of human origins from contemporary science. Lisle immediately jumps on William Lane Craig for assuming that modern science can tell us anything about the past to begin with. He says that science studies the repeatable way God upholds the universe today, and that since scientific method requires testability and repeatability, which is true, it does, it cannot be applied to past events. No, it can't. Sure, it can be used to make educated guesses about the past, but we can't really know for certain. In any case, these educated guesses, even if they are informed by science, are not in a position to judge God's word. Now, you think that that would be obvious, but he will pounce on this in the most worst way possible. The Word of God is inerrant by nature and is therefore superior to our best educated guesses about the past. Alright, he says me. Lisle's response is why it is so easy to say YACs are anti-science. This is a straw man argument. We are not anti-science. Anti-science literally would mean against science. We're not against science. The fact that we're against a particular model of science doesn't mean we're against science. Jason Lisle loves science. He's a scientist. He's an astronomer, astrophysicist. He loves science. He writes lots of books about it, like this right here. One I have right here is The Physics of Einstein. I have other books by Dr. Jason Lisle, like one, Taking Back Astronomy over there. It's on my shelf. And I've got other books by him too. He loves science. Why does he think that he doesn't love science? Because he's against a particular model that he accepts? Because he doesn't think the Word of God should be interpreted on the basis of what secular scientists claim? Alright. And he also might be also doing the equivocation philosophy again with the word science. He's conflating what a scientist says is true with the field of science, or what the scientific evidence can actually show. We don't interpret the Word of God. You think that Jason Lisle's words would be just undisputed for a Christian. For a true Bible-believing Christian who believes in the doctrine of inerrancy and inspiration. I don't know if this guy does or not. But you would think that this would be so obvious to our eyes, to our ears as we're hearing it, that we would amen it. That this was exactly, by the way, this is also one of the tenets of the Chicago Statement of Biblical Inerrancy. It says we do not insert science. And he said earlier that we don't. But he thinks Jason Lisle and young earth creationists are anti-science? Why? Because we don't think the Word of God should be manipulated by what a scientist says? Because we don't accept a particular model that's believed by certain scientists? That doesn't make us anti-science. That's a straw man argument. Alright, he goes further, he says, when you immediately dismiss almost 2 centuries of scientific exploration, discovery, and evidence of the Earth's past, and basically says, modern science can't say anything about the past. What 2 centuries? 2 centuries of claiming that things about the past, of origin and stuff like that? No. What evidence? Show me the evidence. By the way, what scientists have claimed in the past 2 centuries is nothing to do with whether it's possible to get past that limitation in scientific method. Okay, there's a reason historians, because I like history, I love history, I study history, and historians have a different kind of methodology when they approach history. They don't use a scientific method, they use historical methods. Why? Because the scientific method is good for what it was intended, but it has limitations. It is not a catch-all methodology to prove everything. That's not the intention of the scientific method, and therefore it does not work that way. Claiming that it has limitations such as proving a past event doesn't make someone anti-science. And claiming that, 2 centuries of this, and he says scientific exploration, discovery, and evidence. Where? What evidence? What discoveries? What exploration? You got 2 centuries of certain scientists making certain claims based on, like Charles Darwin, who, by the way, was not a scientist. Charles Lisle, who invented the geologic column, which was a lawyer and also was not a scientist. Or James Hutton, the inventor of uniformitarianism, who also was not a scientist. Lemaitre, who invented the Big Bang Theory, was a scientist, but he was a Roman Catholic, but his philosophy was he didn't think we should insert God into the equation, so when he created the Big Bang Theory, he just invented the theory apart from any implications of a divine cause. And then later Gamal got a hold of it and so forth. But anyway, but no. That doesn't change the limitations. It does have that limit. How do you prove a past event, especially in the ancient past or even in the prehistoric past? How do you do that with a methodology that is solely based upon observation, repeatability, and its ability to be experimented on? You can only experiment on things if they're in the present. You can only repeat things if you have them in front of you to observe and see them repeated. You can only observe things if you're watching them. So in this respect, the only things that we can really observe would be events that happen in our own lifetime. But we wouldn't be able to repeat them, and we wouldn't be able to experiment on them. And you certainly couldn't do all 3 for anything in the distant past. What Lisle said was absolutely true, and it's something that I knew a long time ago when I first started college even. I already knew all this. And I love the scientific method. I think the scientific method is good for what it was intended. But I think people do take it much further. By the way, there's a guy that does a YouTube channel called Capturing Christianity, and he had an agnostic on there. I can't remember his name, but he had an agnostic. But he had a agnostic on his program who actually admitted and said that the scientific method has limitations and you can't prove everything with the scientific method. You can't prove everything with it. So what Lisle is saying is not factually inaccurate. It isn't something opposing science. Alright. So let's get past the equivocation fallacy there. What do you expect people's reactions going to be? Well, it is to take facts for what they are. Recognizing the limitation of something doesn't mean you're somehow fighting against it or opposing it or something. You can recognize I recognize human limitations. I recognize my wife is limited in what she can actually do for me. But that doesn't necessarily mean that I'm going to despise her because I recognize limitation. It doesn't mean that I am despising her if I'm recognizing she has limitations. The problem here is that people want to believe the scientific method is invincible and can be used to know everything, including a past event. That's not the way science works. It's not the way it's intended. Alright. He goes further. He says, even when Lisle begrudgingly concedes that, okay, maybe science can give a little bit of an educated guess about the past, because Lisle isn't at all against the idea that science can tell us some things about the past. By some things, he's not really saying it can tell us anything directly about the past, but it may show consistency with a past event happening or whatnot, like archaeology or something. He immediately shuts that down by claiming the Bible is inerrant, but is inerrant, thus implying that God gave us an eyewitness account and that Genesis 1 is history. That's actually not what he was implying by saying it's inerrant, but it is inerrant. It is the inerrant, infallible Word of God. The idea is, what does the Bible say? If the Bible says X, does it mean X? That's the point. But Genesis chapter 1 to 11 is history because of the literary genre that it is. It is in the realm of historical narrative. And he says, and that settles it. That's not his position exactly, but I'm going to count this as the third time Lisle makes the assertion. Again, he pounces on that. And a lot of times I come to find out Lisle doesn't repeat that statement of historical narrative. He's just saying it does. Like anytime he mentions that it's historically true, or he confirms the doctrine of inerrancy or inspiration, and he takes them that way, he just says, I'm just going to say he takes it that way. Later on down the road, he'll say, oh, Lisle says 8, 9, 10 times he mentioned, and he didn't do that at all. That is false. That is deceptive. But he'll say that. And again, repeating assertion of something doesn't make it true. That's why he backed it up with evidence and examples. If you are going to say Genesis 1 to 11 is literal history, you have to point to something. He does. He points to other examples. In fact, he gives examples of other books of the Bible and stuff. Something provably historical in the text. Okay, again, he's conflating two different questions. Notice that. He went from talking about historical narrative, about whether it's presented as literal history, versus whether it's right about what it's saying. And also notice he thinks it should be determined within the text. In other words, he's saying you shouldn't compare it to other literary genres, which is non-historical. Historians and scholars figure out literary genres by comparing it to known literary genres. That's how they do it. You have to point to something probably historical in the text, or some indicator of the text that suggests its genre is history. Well, he did point to something in the text, point genre is history. He pointed to other genres that are historical and showed that it was the same as those. He talked about the Toledos and things like that. So to back up your claim, you can't just continually assert it. He didn't. He backed up evidence and examples. By the way, that's more than what this guy's done. This guy has not backed up a single thing with evidence and examples. And you'll see that because he will have some opportunities to actually present evidence and examples that he doesn't present. Quote number 4, Craig, the stories of Adam and Eve are largely confined to the second and third chapters of Genesis. They are part of the patriarchal narratives, often called the primeval history, which made up Genesis 1 to 11. He says, Lisle's response is quite short. Genesis 1 to 11 is historical narrative, written exactly the same way as all the other historical books in the Bible. Therefore, there can be no doubt that the author of Genesis 1 to 11 intended it to be read as literal history. We're up to historical narrative written exactly the same way as the other historical books of the Bible. Now, this is where where Lisle compares other books of the Bible to it, and he actually, if you read the actual passage that he's summarizing here, and he doesn't put this in the summary, but he actually gives specific examples such as First and Second Chronicles. Which again is how historians and scholars determine literary genre. They compare other known literary genres to make that determination. Alright, he says, we're up to the fourth assertion without any evidence to back it up. He just gave evidence. In fact, he gave evidence in that very post. In fact, here's one of the issues of him summarizing it instead of quoting him, because by summarizing it, he omitted the specific examples that he gives, such as First and Second Chronicles, and he showed contrasting it with that they are of the same literary genre. Again, I am going to put Lisle's article in the description box so you can check it out for yourself. Alright, He said, again, repeating saying that Genesis 1 to 11 is historical narrative doesn't make it true. And saying it's not historical narrative doesn't make it true either, which he keeps on doing. He doesn't provide any evidence for this. And sorry, but no competent reader. Again, there goes the begging question epithet fallacy. I guess that means that anyone who says anything other than what he agrees with, that makes them incompetent. Competent reader thinks that Genesis 1 to 11 is written in the exact same way as the other clearly historical books of the Old Testament. Okay, I guess that means most scholars are incompetent. You heard me correctly. Most scholars, that means Old Testament scholars and Hebrew scholars, most of them, including some secularists as well, most of them will say Genesis chapter 1 through 11 is historical narrative. There's even some OECs in that think that this is historical narrative. It's not just young earth creationists who say it, even older earth creationists say it. They recognize it as being presented as real history. They might reinterpret it differently, but they recognize it. I guess people like Walter Keisler and Norman Geisler, they were just incompetent, weren't they? They saw it as history. They might have reinterpreted it, based on their older perceptions, but they saw it as literal history. I guess they're incompetent too. And most scholars, most Old Testament scholars, and most Hebrew scholars that study the Old Testament of Scripture, most of them, whether we're dealing with Christian, Jews, or secularists, most of them would say that. And I'm not appealing to authority. What I'm simply pointing out is he calling them incompetent? Apparently he is. Are they incompetent? No. And neither am I. We're not incompetent because we disagree with him. He says, no competent reader thinks that Genesis 1 to 11 is written in the exact same way as the other clearly historical books of the Old Testament. Yes, lots of scholars think that's the case. So to be clear, the one thing that Lisle points to in order to try to show that Genesis 1 to 11 is historical narrative actually shows the exact opposite. Give us some examples. Please give us some examples. There's no example at all. First and Second Chronicles, in fact, uses the same type of toledos that Genesis chapter 5 and 11 does. In fact, when they cross over to those chronologies, you often find the exact same chronology. You don't get the kinds of information, the kinds of writing differently. You don't get that. But he's saying, oh yes it is. He says you find the exact opposite. Give me some examples. Quote number 5. Old Testament scholars have long remarked on the resemblance of Genesis 1 to 11 to the religious literature of ancient Near East. Lisle responds by saying it has only been over the recent couple of centuries that these claims have been made, which is true, so that it really hasn't been long remarked by scholars. Besides, Lisle says it is not true that Genesis 1 to 11 is resemble other ancient Near Eastern religious literature, also true. Genesis is historical narrative, and that's different from pagan myths, and the details of events in Genesis don't match the details of the pagan origin myths. He goes further. He says, okay, he has a more longer response here. He says, we are up to the 5th assertion without evidence to back it up. And a lot of these, when I looked them up, I didn't see him actually saying historical narrative. Sometimes he just is interpreting them that way, or he's making it sound that way, and so forth. So it's weird. And he counts it every single time. He thinks that that's ultimately what he's saying, even though the whole discussion is over what the literary genre of Genesis 1 through 11 is. Lisle's position is going to be its historical narrative. Craig's position is that he thinks it's mytho-history, and Lisle's responding to that position. So you expect him to push that point across. because that's the whole discussion's about. Well, I mean, what does he think this is about? You know, fluffy bunnies? I mean, this is about the literary genre of Genesis 1 through 11, which Lisle takes it being historical narrative, as do I. He says, merely asserting Genesis 1 through 11 is historical narrative makes it true. Again, not saying it's not true doesn't make it not true either. But the evidence does make it true. And Lisle does point to evidence. Not only that, to deny the literary similarities between Genesis 1 through 11 and other ancient Near Eastern myths is beyond ignorant. Again, you see the begging question, Epic of fallacy there. It's ignorant. You're ignorant if you don't agree with him. Most scholars don't agree with you. I don't agree with him. Some OECs don't agree with him. Every YEC you can imagine don't agree with him. Stephen Boyd, who's a Hebrew scholar who contributed his literary analysis of Genesis chapter 1 through 11 in this book right here, Radioisotopes and the Age of the Earth, volume 2, peer reviewed, by the way. Both of the volumes of Radioisotopes and the Age of the Earth, volumes 1 and 2, are peer reviewed. And the last chapter, I think the last chapter of this book, is written by Stephen Boyd, which he does a statistical analysis between historical narrative and poetic narrative and Genesis chapter 1 through 11. And he determined not only that it was not poetic narrative, it lacked parallelisms and so forth, but also that it was indeed historical narrative. And Lisle points this out too, facts and stuff that back this up. For example, it has irrelevant details in it. The historical, poetic narrative or any fictional story would not have, because it would bog down a fictional story. And Lisle mentions all this. But apparently he didn't mention any evidence according to this guy, because he's summarizing him and then tweaking out the evidence. He's either tweaking it, rewording it, or even subtracting the evidence that he presents. And he says he didn't present no evidence when he did. Alright. Which I find to be very deceptive. Alright. It's not beyond ignorant to sit there and say it's not ancient Near Eastern myth. I study ancient Near Eastern myths. I've got, you saw that I have documents on that. It's very different from Genesis chapters 1 through 11. If he says otherwise, I would love to see some examples of it. Provide me the examples of where they're so similar. Alright. Put the story of Noah's flood in Genesis 6 through 9 next to the flood story of Gilgamesh. Okay. Here is the first time he wants to provide an example. A good chance. A good opportunity to give me some evidence. Here's what he says. Okay. Put the story of Noah's flood in Genesis 6 through 9 next to the flood story of Gilgamesh. Genesis 6 through 9 is written like Gilgamesh. Does he say anything else about that? No. He doesn't provide any other evidence. He gives no examples of how they are alike. He just says it. He just asserts it. No examples, no evidence, just an assertion. I got the Epic of Gilgamesh. I showed you the Epic of Gilgamesh. It's written in poetic narrative. It is very different from Genesis chapter 1 through 11. Now, he might be saying that the flood story has similar elements, like similar birds being released or something like that. But that's, again, conflating information, with literary genre, which is the form of the writing that's being written in versus the information that's actually in it. Two different literary genres can actually share the same information. For example, a romance novel and a love poem can both have the same references. They could have references to heart, references to love a lot of mushy elements to it, which you would expect, but yet they be two different genres. Okay, say for example you have one genre. Have there been any poems, because that's poetic narrative, poems, poetry. Have you ever seen any poems written about the American West? Well, sure, American West was often romanticized, right? So if you have a poem about the American West, and you have another text over here, and then you suddenly realize they have similar elements. There are cowboys in both of them, for example, or that they're both about a specific cowboy. Let's say Jesse James. They're both reference a bank robbery that took place, And you say, well, that must mean the same literary genre, except the other text is a biography of Jesse James. But this one's a poem about Jesse James. So guess what? They could have similar information, but the literary genres could be very different from each other. So that's conflating two different categories. Again, Bill in his book does recognize this is a categorical error. He does it accusing another writer of it, but he does recognize this is a categorical error. Alright, he goes further. He says, we can go through the rest of Genesis 1 through 11 and point to literary similarities with other ancient Eastern myths. Why doesn't he? Why doesn't he point to more? He hasn't even really even point to one, because here he says that it's like Gilgamesh and leaves it at that. He never provides any examples. And then he goes here like he's already provided an example. He hasn't provided any examples. He just asserted that it was like Gilgamesh and then moved on. And he says that we could do that throughout Genesis 1 through 11. Then why doesn't he? Now I can understand he's limited on space, but he can at least do a few examples. He at least do one. He didn't even do one up here. He just said it was like Gilgamesh and then moved on from that. Alright. He says, therefore, when it comes to the way, in other words, he's not going to provide any examples. Therefore, when it comes to the way and style in which Genesis 1 through 11 is written, it is walks like a duck and quacks like a duck. It's a duck. I agree. That's why it's historical narrative, because the evidence supports it as historical narrative. Now, again, we are simply talking in terms of literary style and genre. Yes, we are, except he keeps conflating literary style and genre, which, by the way, style and genre is actually the same thing. So it's just literary genre or literary style. It isn't both, because they're not two separate things. But he keeps conflating literary style or genre with information, the content or substance within the text, which is not the same thing. It's a major categorical error. That doesn't mean Genesis 1 through 11 isn't true. Now here he's saying it's not true. Doesn't mean it's not true, but yeah, he wants to recognize it as fictitious or non-historical. In fact, he even sat there and tried to argue several times, now more than once, that he doesn't think there's anything historical evidence of anything Genesis chapters 1 through 11 said, and now he wants to say, oh, well, it doesn't mean it's not true. You can't have something that's both true and false at the same time, the same way. That's impossible. It's a violation of a law of logic called law of non-contradiction. He goes further and says, it simply means something that should be obvious. Okay, there is actually a fallacy. I forgot what his name is. It's in Bo Bennett's book. I have it on the shelf. I had it out earlier. But there's a fallacy where you claim something is obvious and you substitute the word obvious for evidence. And there is actually a fallacy like that. But if it was obvious, it would be apparent to everybody. And most scholars would not accept the fact that Genesis chapter 1 through 11 is historical narrative. Alright. He says, it's written in the same style as those other ancient Near Eastern stories we call myths, which he never presented any evidence for or any examples of this. And this is actually false. It's not. I showed you several examples of ancient Near Eastern myths. We can cover it a little bit more. See here, this is the Epic of Gilgamesh. Okay. It's not written in the same language at all as Genesis chapter 1 through 11 is. We can look at Enuma Elish, a very famous creation account, Babylonian creation account. It's written in poetic narrative, there's heavy parallelisms, and you can just read it and you can tell that this is not in the same even in the same ballpark as the literary genre of Genesis chapters 1 to 11, which is being presented as real historical narrative, real history. It's presented as real history. All right. So if he's going to make this claim, he's going to need to provide evidence and examples, and he has not provided even one. All right. Let's move further. And of course, the details in Genesis 1 to 11 don't match many of the details in the ancient Near Eastern myths okay, wait a minute. He just got through claiming that they're similar, therefore the same literary genre. Now he turns around and admits that there are significant differences in this. He says, and of course, the details in Genesis, he says, and it is those, said, of course, the details of Genesis 1 to 11 don't match many of the details of ancient Near Eastern myths, which they don't. That's because they're not the same genre. It is those different details that shape the vastly different theology found in Genesis chapter 1 through 11. The theology is monotheistic viewpoint, which they will not borrow from the language of ancient Near Eastern literature that they don't agree with. Alright, he says, simply put, the genre is the same. No, it isn't. It's very different. That's why historians and scholars have rejected it so long. But the message and theology is vastly different. Okay, he thinks the message and theology is different, but that the history is the same. Or the genre is the same. No, it isn't. The genre is very different. And the theology, by the way, as for the theology, this is a monotheistic culture. Now, what is the probability of a monotheistic culture borrowing from sources and language that they don't agree with? That they don't agree with. It's highly improbable. So it is very inconsistent to say that their theology and message don't match, but then claim the genre matches. No. He goes further, he says, by the way, the reason why scholars have only started noting the similarities between Genesis 1 to 11 and these other ancient Near Eastern myths over the last 2 centuries is because it has only been over the last 2 centuries that archaeologists have found these ancient writings of ancient Near Eastern myths. Now this is speculation. He's speculating what they would do if they had this. They don't know what they would do. You honestly don't, because they don't have them one way or the other. So you can't predict what they would have done. But it is highly unlikely that they would have taken it. But I will tell you that in a second, because he's going to give a few examples here of people that he thinks would have taken it if they had these literature in front of them. Basically, do you know why Augustine, Aquinas, and Luther never claimed that Genesis 1 through 11 was similar to ancient Near Eastern myths? Because they didn't have them. He speculated. This is speculation right here. This is pure speculation. Okay, you don't know what they would have done. But it is highly unlikely that Augustine, who was writing in the 6th century AD, and by the way, just to let you know, we don't know if Augustine didn't have these literature in front of him. We didn't have them. But we don't know if Augustine didn't have them. How do you know Augustine didn't have these literature still floating around in the 6th century AD? You don't. You have to assume that he didn't. You have to speculate that he didn't. You don't know he didn't. He's writing in the 6th century. How do you know he didn't? And this is one of the greatest theologians of the 6th century. Okay? And you got Aquinas around the 1200s, around the Middle Ages. You got Luther around the 1500s. Luther around the 1500s is the only one likely to not have had these access to these sources. The other two, there's always a possibility they could have. Especially Augustine, who was writing around the 6th century, by the way. But to say that they probably would have taken these as myths, Augustine is a very heavy Christian theologian. Okay, 6th century. Aquinas is a Roman Catholic, and Luther is a Roman Catholic priest, or monk, excuse me, Roman Catholic monk, trained Roman Catholic monk. Okay? And all three of these guys were very heavily religious and very heavily Bible prone. They would not have assumed that they were myths, even if they had those literature. How could they? Why would they? The literature is very different. Alright, let's move on. You got quote number 6. I think this is the last quote. This is a big one because he wants to make a concluding statement on this. It says, Craig says, grand themes such as creation of the world, the origin of mankind, and the near destruction of humanity in the cosmic flood are present in both ancient myths and Genesis 1 through 11. Yeah, but it's also present in every the flood story. At least it's present in every ancient culture around the world, or in every culture, not just ancient, all the way from ancient to modern. Every culture around the world has possessed this flood story, and it's all over the world. And the vast majority of these stories are global. All right. He says Lisle begins by saying that Genesis 1 to 11 is historical narrative, written just like all the other historical books in the Old Testament, and that it doesn't have symbolism or poetic literary devices, which you don't. He then points out that, other than when people are quoted, of course, because there are two blocks of poetic text where people are cited, and Lisle knows this as well. Like when Adam sees his wife for the first time, he says, "Bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh." Or when Lamech makes his boast. That's the only time you ever see poetic narrative. But if it was poetic narrative as a literary style, it would be throughout, especially in the narrative, like what you see in the Book of Psalms, which is actually poetic narrative. Genesis historical narrative, while the ancient Near Eastern stories are, he goes. Okay, he says, he then points out that pagan myths, there is a primordial chaos monster, which is, but that Genesis creation account doesn't have that. Pagan myths are polytheistic, while Genesis monotheistic. Sure, these pagan myths and Genesis talk about origins, but Genesis is historical narrative. He does actually say that it's historical narrative. Now, he doesn't say it every single time he says it, but it doesn't matter whether he repeats it or not. He's sitting there dealing with a statement or dealing with quotes by Bill Craig, and he's responding to those quotes. The fact that he repeats historical narrative doesn't mean he doesn't give evidence for it. He gives evidence for it constantly. This guy has, ironically, made lots of assertions and not given any evidence or examples for what he has said so far, although he has asserted it. All right. Historical narrative, while the ancient Near Eastern stories are myths, Lisle then says William McCraig is confusing drama with content, which he is, and proceeds to say that the Big Bang Theory and evolution try to explain the origin of the universe and mankind in a way that is more like ancient Eastern mythology than the Genesis account, creation account. He then says the Big Bang Theory is similar to the yin and yang in Oriental origin mythology. As for Noah's flood, Lisle again says that Genesis 6-9 is historical narrative. God told Moses the details about it on Mount Sinai. The flood happened about 1,656 years after the creation, and when people were dispersed from the Tower of Babel, they all took with them the variations of the historical event of the flood, but a historically accurate account was preserved in Genesis. We know the Epic of Gilgamesh isn't right because the dimensions invoked in that story don't work, and besides, it was written as poetry, poetic narrative, and Genesis is historical narrative. Besides, since Noah's sons Shem, Japheth, and Ham were still alive at that point anyway, people have gotten eyewitness accounts from them. Not only that, but that the fact that we are given details like the ages of the patriarch, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, when their children were born, further shows that Genesis is written as historical narrative. Says me. First, we have the 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, and 10th instances. Remember, he's also counting instances where he doesn't say historical narrative, but he's interpreting them that way. Instance of assertion that Genesis 1 to 11 is historical narrative without evidence. He presented evidence. Actually, he presented evidence in the previous quote. The summary that he did, even in the summary he did, it shows that he presented evidence. So he did present evidence for it. So this is false completely. He says, second, to say that Genesis 1 to 11 doesn't have symbolism or literary device, it is astoundingly ignorant. Again, he says it's ignorant, and yet he provided no evidence for it at all. No examples at all of why it would be ignorant to say that. I guess because it disagrees with what he thinks. Name a poetic device in it and prove and demonstrate that it's symbolic. Do it. I dare you. There is no symbolic elements there that you can demonstrate for sure. Third, again, of course, many of the specific details in Genesis 1 to 11 are different from pagan myths. Well, of course, it's different because it's a different literary style. Of course it's different. The reason why there is no chaos monster in Genesis 1, okay, it sounds like he's about to speculate, is because that author is stating that there is only one God and that no one is his equal. Oh my God. He just basically speculated the reason why. The reason why it doesn't have a chaos monster because it is not at all on par with ancient Near Eastern literature, ancient Near Eastern myths. That's why there's no chaos monster in it. This right here appears to be ad hoc rescue. It's just ad hoc. There's no evidence at all for what he just said. Alright, that difference in theology, which he speculated, does not mean the genre of Genesis 1-11 isn't myth. It is when the point that Jason is making is that it's fundamentally different from ancient Near Eastern myth. Because he's argued the entire time that they were alike. Now we're getting into the really nit and gritty of this argument, and he can't back up a single example. Not only that, but he agrees that they're different. Alright, that difference, and he thinks it's a difference in theology. It's not a difference in theology, it's a difference in content. It's a difference in style. These other literary, literature, ancient Near Eastern literature, are written in poetic narrative. This is not written in poetic narrative. Even Craig admits that in his book. Okay, and he says, this is difference in theology does not mean the genre of Genesis 1-11 isn't myth. Yes, it does. Fourth, do I have to state how ludicrous it is? Again, making question epithet fallacy. It is to say that the Big Bang Theory is similar to ancient Near Eastern myths. The point that he's making is he's doing what's called a reductio ad absurdum argument. He's showing that the conclusion is absurd by seeing the same thing. Lisle doesn't even believe in the theory of evolution, and he's not necessarily saying that it is like ancient. He's not making that contrast. You guys, the guy that's writing this article, Craig, is the one who's making that contrast. Not with the Big Bang exactly, but with Genesis chapters 1-11 and ancient Near Eastern myths. So what he's doing is he's saying, assuming the same thing, if you took the arguments where you looked at content and what kind of things it says, the similarities between that and the Big Bang Theory and evolution are striking. That's the point that he's making, and he's missing his point. Alright, he says, and does Lisle even have any idea about the yin and yang in Taoist thought? No, he obviously doesn't. He provides no examples or evidence of reasons why he thinks he has no idea. How does he know what Jason knows about yin and yang in Taoist thought? How does he know that? He's speculating what Lisle thinks or knows or what kind of information he has. I mean, it's one thing to say, I don't think he knows anything about it because, this guy says XYZ and XYZ is false. And here's the evidence why it's false. That's one thing to say that. But then to say, does he have any idea? I don't think he does. And then leave it at that. I guess he can read minds now. Fifth, I've never heard the claim that the flood account was passed down by Noah's sons who were at the Tower of Babel. Actually, the claim is that the people at the Tower of Babel passed the story along. His sons would have probably done the same thing. But actually, this is a very common theory. This is a very common theory. I don't know how he didn't hear it. This is one of the most common theories. This is the reason why people are said to speak different languages today. This is the reason why it is said that all these cultures have the flood story in them. Because they pass along this information, showing a historical core to the flood story. Alright? And this is very commonplace stuff. I don't even know how you've not heard of it. And it's a very plausible theory, by the way, that be the case. But interesting enough, the question has to be, why does the fact that he's never heard of it have anything to do with the truthfulness of the claim or its plausibility? Well, it doesn't. Alright, he says, finally, I fail to see how the mention of the ages of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph proves that the flood story is historical narrative. It does so because of the kinds of information They're presenting the Toledo, the kinds of stuff you see in historical narrative. I have the Epic of Gilgamesh. There's nothing like the genealogies that we find in Genesis 5 and 11, as well as Genesis 25, in any of these ancient Near Eastern myths. None. That's the point. The literary style is different. If this story was a fictional story, they would be bogged down by irrelevant details. If this was ancient Near Eastern myths that were telling fictional stories and written in poetic narrative, they would have never mentioned specific time in which the person, how old the person was when someone was born, how old they were when they died. These are not the kind of information we see in ancient Near Eastern literature. Alright. He says, but then again, perhaps Lisle is proposing conflating Genesis 1 to 11 with Genesis 12 to 50. Again, he seems to not understand how literary analysis at work. You actually compare it to other literary analysis of known literary genres. That's how you do it. How do you think we know the Gospels are Greco-Roman biographies? You think we just looked at them and say one day that, well, they look like history, so I guess they must be history? Or did we compare them to Greco-Roman biographies? That's how we tell. If you're willing to say, and I think this guy is willing to say, chapter 12 to 50 of Genesis is historical narrative, then you would compare it. But Lisle isn't just comparing chapter 12 to 50 to Genesis chapter 1 to 11. He's comparing other books of the Bible that are known history. They consider historical narrative, like 1st and 2nd Chronicles, 1st and 2nd Kings, like New Testament works, like the Gospels. And he's making this contrast. And he's looking at the literary genre to see if it's indicative of historical Hebrew or a Hebrew historical narrative. And it is. And he says, there you have it. Yes, you do. He says, Lisle's conclusion simply restates the points he makes in his article. That's what conclusions do, by the way. There isn't much more I can say other than this. It is a very silly article. I am going to link his article in the description box below, like I said. It is not a silly article. This man is a very smart man. He knows what he's saying. And you can be the judge of it yourself. But it's not a silly article at all. In my next post, he says, I'll guide you through more silliness, not silliness, in part 2 of Lisle's critique of William Lane Craig's book. Now listen what he says. By the way, do you feel you really learned anything about William Lane Craig actually argues in his book? I don't. I've learned about William Lane Craig's book from other articles and interviews, but certainly not from Lisle's critique. When you offer a critique of a book or article, but fail to articulate what the book or article actually says, it's not a good critique. Lisle is not critiquing Dr. Jason Lisle is not critiquing this book. That's not at all where those quotes were coming from. Rather, instead, they were coming from Bill Craig's article. Let me show that to you right now. This is William Lane Craig's article in First Things. It's available online for free. I will link it in the description box below. It's titled The Historical Adam by William Lane Craig, October 2021. Now, look. What historical claims does the Bible make about Adam and Eve? This is an exact quote. Jason Lisle quoted William Lane Craig exactly. And if you look all through it, these are the kinds of things that are mentioned in it. Is this guy just unaware, completely unaware of William Lane Craig's First Things article? Maybe. So I didn't really find his article very convincing. He offered no evidence, no examples at all. Well, I guess this would be it for this particular part. I'm going to do one of every part that he comes out with. So far I've seen 3 parts. I will continue to look for the 4th part. If you know of the 4th part and I'm not aware of it, put it in the comment section. I will certainly look at the link below. I will also put 3 links in my description box. One of Dr. Jason Lisle's article, one of this guy's article that I'm responding to, as well as William Lane Craig's article in First Things on the historical Adam. so you can actually make the comparisons yourself. For now, just stay in the know.